Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much all for coming for this session. I'm going to bring up our panelists, who are much more distinguished than I am, to the stage in a few moments. But first of all, we have a message that comes from the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mitsutori, and she will set the stage for the discussion that we're going to have today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am truly sorry for missing the opportunity to be with you in person for the 2022 GESDA Summit, which appropriately falls on the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, organized this year under the theme of Early Warning and Early Action. Improving global risk understanding is at the core of our work at the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it is clear that digital models can improve the prediction and management of risk and thereby help vulnerable countries and communities build their resilience. Extreme weather events are an area of particular concern to many countries given their growing socioeconomic impact. Now, more than ever, we need data, tools, and models to better anticipate such events and mitigate their impact. To that end, my team has been working with the GESDA task force for the past year, helping shape a possible science diplomacy solution idea around this topic. At our session last year, we discussed how these models could be of use to decision makers and whether they can be made flexible enough to include local contexts and actors in the design of policy or relief solutions. Moreover, it is essential that these tools look not only at hazards such as earthquakes and floods, but also at their cascading impact on factors such as displacement, economic systems, and food security. There must also be trust and transparency in the models to enable full utilization. How we achieve this will be at the core of this session's reflections. That is why I am encouraged that this session will bring together key inputs from both developers and users. Your reflections can guide the building of trust between the science and diplomacy communities. I thank you for being part of this session, and I look forward to its outcomes.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that frames the challenge of today's session, and more importantly, the challenge of what is being undertaken in the whole realm of developing digital twins in order to improve the quality of policy making in areas not only related to disaster risk reduction, but to better planning of the interface between the Earth system and human actions, both planned and unplanned in that context. Could I invite the panelists to take up their positions on the stage? Thank you very much. Let's try and frame the challenge that we face. We live in a highly connected, complex system, which we call the Earth. In that overall context, the interface between human behavior and the workings of the Earth system itself poses a range of challenges at different scales. Digital twins and avatars are a new set of instruments that are being used increasingly to allow us to address the challenges of understanding and monitoring in real time those interfaces and interactions. And that's what we're going to try and unpack today. There is a problem, however, because it involves the collection of enormous amounts of data. Using satellites, data sensors, the Internet of Things, and everything that you're familiar with in the greater scheme of the artificial intelligence and related technological revolutions taking place today. And therefore, the key question around all of those issues, matters of data privacy, transparency, accountability, and ownership, is who should be responsible? Where should ownership vest? How should we ensure that there is adequate societal participation to enable effective trust between citizens and the instruments that are being used ostensibly to improve their lives in the workings of a complex system? For that, because of the scale on which much of this is undertaken, we need not only good practices, but international standards. And we aim this morning to try to unpack these challenges. The panelists will first of all discuss the present state of digital models, and then discuss how to advance and to govern their use, manage the risks associated with that, which you've already heard something about, and to develop ethical standards for their application. Now, the way in which we're going to tackle this is to explore, firstly, the use of models at different scales. And the first speaker on that issue is actually going to be Neil Davies, who is a remarkable human being. He lives in French Polynesia, for a start, Moorea, which means that he has probably traveled further than anyone else to get to this summit. You see, he's looking very cheerful despite that, but nonetheless. The Digital Empowerment Navigating System of the IDEA Consortium employs island digital ecosystem avatars and inclusive democratic ecological action to help us in navigating the Anthropocene, using collective intelligence and socio-ecological foresight. Neil is going to speak to that first, and then we're going to contrast that with something that is on a much larger scale, but not yet deployed at scale. So Christian Kirchsteiger, who is an expert on digital models for policy making and implementation from the European Commission, will speak to Destination Earth, which is an initiative of the Commission that aims to develop a high-precision digital model of the whole Earth to monitor and predict environmental change and human impact to support sustainable development. You can see the difference between the two scales immediately. Then we're going to come to two distinguished practitioners who use digital instruments for the purpose of planning and implementation in their own environments. Zhongwen Huang, who is from the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office in Singapore, is going to share with us his description of the digital governance tools that Singapore employs and their use in data-informed whole-of-government urban planning and development, using data to understand urban systems and deal with the risks from automation and cyberspace. And all of you will recognize that Singapore's extremely highly regarded capacity for strategic foresight plays fundamentally into that particular dialogue. We then have Soledad Garcia Ferrari, who is actually from the University of Edinburgh, but whose primary focus is on Latin America. She employs digital tools to improve governance in Latin American rural and urban spaces, primarily through data collection and citizen empowerment, especially in vulnerable neighborhoods affected by climate change. And finally, on the panel today, we have my distinguished co-chair, Dirk Helbing of ETH Zurich, who is the professor of computational social science there and has more than 2 decades, to my certain knowledge, of research and practice associated with the importance of political and social accountability in the development of instruments of this sort. And today he will be speaking particularly about the governance of digital twins and will share insights into essential principles for active and effective citizen engagement. So that's the objective of the session. Hopefully it makes sense in terms of a flow, and hopefully we will all emerge from this having shared ideas and insights more enlightened than we are. Neil, can I pass it on to you?
Sure. Thank you very much. And yeah, very happy to be here. If I had a watch, it would be the right time, but 12 hours different from where I came from. So that's my excuse if anything I say is completely incoherent. But it's a pleasure to be here, and having traveled such a long way, but I think it's important for the islands of the Pacific, the center of the blue continent, to be represented in some of the issues and challenges that we face in the Pacific Islands, where I've lived for over 20 years now on the island of Moorea. So I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing, actually, which initiated to a large extent here in Switzerland with Matthias Treuer, who hosted a workshop in Zurich in 2013 around the challenge of could we build an integrated model of an entire social ecological system from sort of molecules up, the physical model, biological, ecological, and social economic components of that system. Given that this island in particular is the subject of international research, I run a research station for the University of California that's been on the island since 1985. The French National Lab, CRIOB, has been on the island since 1971, and particular focus on the coral reefs. So these are some of the most intensively studied coral reefs anywhere and continuously studied anywhere in the world. So I'll talk mainly from a sort of scientific point of view of how we build these models and data that we rely on for them. But as we're at GESDA, I'll start with a little diplomatic history. And back in 1989, when Margaret Thatcher was not known for being an environmental activist, but she was giving a speech at the UN, and as I understand, one of the first speeches, really imploring the UN to take climate change seriously and start action, led to the formation of the IPCC. But looking at her speech, it's quite remarkable. She kicks off this speech talking about a young Charles Darwin standing on a mountainside of Tahiti, looking across at Moorea and saying that the island Moorea looked like a picture in a frame. The island surrounded by its coral reefs. Normally here I'd have all these amazing slides, which would be much more interesting than what I'm saying. But so this picture in a frame, and then she went on to talk about Fred Hoyle, an astronomer, and his prediction I think it was in the 50s, that one day we'll be able to go to space and take a photograph of the Earth, and that will change history. And that was a prediction he was making. So these references she made at this speech seem a little obscure, but I think she was onto something. What she was really recognizing is the importance of viewing the whole. And when we can see the whole, be it an island in the South Pacific, in the ocean, or island Earth, suspended in space, it changes our understanding. We can see this for the first time in its entirety. And that's a really significant step forward. So this first point I wanted to make is really a holistic approach. We're really trying to make observations across all scientific domains, including the social and economic domain. The second point is one already referred to of scale. The big challenge scientifically is working from the scale of the planet down to, as I'll point out, scale of molecules at least, maybe not submolecular. But for some of the problems that we face in the South Pacific, the wicked challenges that we have, for example, around, which you've all heard of, no doubt, coral bleaching or infectious disease. We heard about dengue fever and mosquito-borne disease yesterday. These are really serious problems. They're caused to some extent or exacerbated by climate change. So there's global drivers of why we're having these problems. Climate change, commerce, trade, travel, etc. But they're also incredibly local, and the causes of coral bleaching, these microbes are being expelled by the coral hosts. These are happening at a cellular, organismal, and a lot of the important things to understand are playing out at the molecular level, the calcification pathway and how different coral species respond to ocean acidification, for example, or the genetics of the microbes, the dengue virus, and how it interacts with the mosquito. So we need to understand things at the scale of molecules and cells and organisms, how organisms interact to form communities and ecosystems. But we also have to understand the global forces that are driving all of this and the interaction between them. So we need to study the planet basically from genome up and planet down. So that's vastly challenging, to put it mildly. But science has tackled this. We do tackle this in science, and in health care, for example, we study human biology is vastly complex, but we've simplified things, tried to reduce the complexity a little bit through model system approach using model organisms like the nematode worm or the fruit fly. Basically, on Moorea, we've been, for at least the last 20 years, trying to deliberately build a model ecosystem not a model organism, but a model ecosystem. And like, what would that mean, and how do you do that? So we've developed a roadmap, which I obviously don't have time to go into here. But a key part of that roadmap is the integration of data. And data are coming in situ. We still can't read genes from satellites, so we have to do a lot of work in situ, but we have amazing new sensors, some of which we've heard about at this meeting. So there's incredible new sources of data, enabling us not necessarily data to view one thing in a new way, but to view how things interact with each other. That's new. And to be able to do it at the scale of a whole system, that's also new. So but we need to integrate those data, and then there's computational power to assist us in understanding what all those data streams mean. And that gets to the next point, really, that this all feeds into scientific discovery and understanding. But ultimately, the point is to support human decisions. So how do we basically function as a decision support system? And that was really the idea of a digital twin or an avatar, is integrating these data and the understanding that's coming, at least from the scientific side, to connect it to society, and as an interface, people can say, okay, we trust this, or do we trust this? Is it transparent enough to say these models that we can now visualize through this digital twin avatar technology are going to inform our decisions? So think of it like a self-driving car. We're getting all these data coming in, and the car's driving, but we're driving an island, we're not driving a car. But we're using all these data sources to alter our decisions, whether it's on the design of, say, marine protected areas, or fishing policy, or invasive species, or infectious disease. We're getting some data coming in, we're finding this new virus, maybe we should drive the island in a little different way to respond. And I'll finish with this, that sort of Tesla or digital twin. We built the Tesla, we understand, Elon Musk built the Tesla, I guess we understand how it works. But then we're saying, how should it respond? What's the highway code for the Tesla? And that's something that society needs to say, what should be the constraints on it? And for driving the island, the constraints, I would argue, along sort of Kate Rayworth's idea of donut economics, is we're driving between the sustainable development goals socially. We can't let anyone fall into poverty under the threshold of human welfare, but we have to do it within the constraints of the life support systems of the planet, so within the planetary boundaries. So those sort of are highway code. But that's not enough. A self-driving car, a self-driving island, maybe we can automate some of this. But where are we driving to? Now that's another decision that has to come only from society. And so that's the last point about the democratic ecological action. We're going to be taking these actions, we're driving our island somewhere. And so this is not really a Tesla, I'd like to say maybe the Hokulea, the voyaging canoe model. It's like everyone in that canoe needs to decide where we're going. And we're taking the island to a new future. We need to agree on where we want to get there and use these tools to help us navigate safely to the future. To future utopias. And I'd quote Oscar Wilde about that, because that's apparently what humans always do. We always try and set sail for a new utopia, but we need to agree democratically what that is. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And may I just say from GESDA's perspective that this fits extraordinarily well with those three questions that you were all confronted with yesterday morning. Who are we as humans? How do we coexist peacefully and thrive? And how do we respect the planetary boundaries within which we have to enable thriving communities? So I'm sure you understand the salience of what we're discussing. Now, we're going to come to Christian, who's going to discuss a much larger scale, but on a similar set of principles. Christian.
Thank you. Well, it's on a much larger scale, and at the same time on a much less developed one, because what exists so far is the concept, and the actual development is starting, and the governance and the environment, so to say, is starting to be developed. And well, forgive me, but since I'm coming from the European Commission, I'm kind of semi-obliged to more or less deal with slides. So I have two slides with me. Both of well, at least the first one is the outcome of a long consensus-finding process, so appreciate the results, please. The second one then is more of my personal opinion. So to start with, I was invited here to talk about an initiative, rather large and rather substantial initiative by the European Commission, which is running now since, well, 2.5 years more or less, which is called Destination Earth, and which is really about, well, let's put it that way, the origin of the whole thing is the convergence of availabilities, the availability of computing power, the availability of excellent modeling capabilities, and the availability, at least the potential one, of excellent data. And all that came together really coincidentally with the arrival of the new Commission. You know, this is a periodic process to set in a new European Commission, and the new European Commission always has an ambitious policy program, and one of the flagships of the current Commission is, as you at least the ones from Europe might know, is the so-called Green Deal, which is a very ambitious climate, well, or green transition, green and digital transition initiative and set of policy measures, very substantial. And all that came together, and one of the outcomes was really this initiative, and actually it's even mentioned in the Green Deal. Should you ever read this communication, then you will actually find this initiative mentioned, not with this name, because the name didn't exist at that time, but the principle, the kind of policy intention to significantly improve Europe's capabilities with regard to disaster risk management and anticipation of environmental extremes, as well as with regard to climate change adaptation. So this is the kind of birth history of this initiative, and what it's really all about is, as you can or most probably cannot read from this slide, it's about creating as a long-term process, as a continuous long-term process, and actually this long-term process is something really rather new for a Commission initiative, because usually such type of funded initiatives are limited to a couple of years, and then there's a follow-up project which is kind of semi-parallel and so on, but to have the intention to have a consistent development line of a decade, more or less, as it's shown here, is something really new. So this, I think, underlines the seriousness of the whole initiative. So it's about creating a so-called digital twin of the Earth, so of the socio-economic system of the Earth and the physical drive, or the physical pressures rather. So the concept is then the digital twin, or rather a set of digital twins. We have, so far we have commissioned, and actually the development is ongoing now, two twins, two thematic twins, one on climate change adaptation and the other one on disaster risk management. So on environmental extremes, weather-driven and geophysical ones, simply because this is part of the policy origin of the whole initiative. If we now go to the second slide, which I hope is a bit more readable, what we realized early on, or actually before the whole thing started really, was that this is what is called science for policy. So science for policy is, it's supposed to be something labeled science for policy. So the end user are policy services, at least in the first instance. So it's not science for science. I mean, this is a side effect, so to say, but the main purpose is science for policy. So they are on EU level policy end users, they are on member state level, and perhaps in the future also together with international organizations. But in the end, it's science for policy, and science for policy is somewhat specific, as it talks to another audience, and it does not only involve classical science elements, but it involves elements which go beyond classical science, classical modeling, classical use of data, or use of numbers really, of use of predictions, for example, in this case. And so for such applications, and this is nothing new what I'm saying, I mean this has a long history of reflection and on the more philosophical, but also more on the practical level, what to do with numbers in a policy context. And for that, clearly things like classical peer review, classical uncertainty assessment, quality assurance, sensitivity analysis is not sufficient. So additional dimensions which go beyond, let's say, technical quality need to be taken into account. And what I would like to offer here briefly for your reflection and maybe discussion, essentially two points. The first one is, and this leads back to what Neil said before. I mean, all these tools only make sense at the right level, so to say. So they need to be right-sized for real users, and both is important. I mean, the right size, but also the real user, not a symbolic one. The response of Destination Earth to that is that we are not trying to develop a new supermodel encompassing the entire Earth plus humankind in this case, but what we are really trying to create is a set of very good models, as we think, based on the best available science and data and everything, and technology and everything. But also, maybe even more important, this is my personal view, to create an open infrastructure where you can, and you means really you, can benchmark your own approaches, can not only play with these tools in an interactive manner, but also benchmark your own models and your own data. So this open approach, in that sense, also the right sizing. And the second additional dimension of quality, which I think is really essential, is a little bit what I indicated before, that I mean, all these models are conditional to something, even if this is not explicitly written or hardly ever written. So models are very different, even for the same problem, and the outcomes are very different accordingly. And this is not such a big issue in Science for Science, because then you have your classical peer review, and you have your understanding that all science in the end is just is a continuous process. But it's a problem if you deal with policy end users, and because of that, I cannot say we developed, but we are thinking about developing a kind of mapping process on these, if you like, deeper levels of uncertainties, which then show you the end user, the real end user, the non-expert, the policy end user in this case, the limitations and the conditions of a model. So these 2 points, the right sizing for the real user and the visualization of the limitations, in our view, are the key ingredients to make such models, independent of the scale actually, in principle, informative for a policy end user. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think you're getting a theme running through the whole of this. There is modeling capability, there is observation capability, there is the capacity to be able to integrate these in ways that bring additional clarity in respect of the working of the Earth system itself and human interactions with it, but humans have to control the outcomes. Humans have to be able to draw policy implications from these interactions in meaningful ways. Neil spoke about it at different scales, from global observation down to local impact. And Christian has just set out very clearly the considerations that the Commission is applying in the developing of Destiny over the period up to the end of the century. We're now going to come to people who use this in practice. And we're going to go firstly to Zhongwen Huang to talk about Singapore's experience in this regard.
Thanks, Sean. I think there are a few questions that probably resonate with many in the room that we often hear about. We often hear about a lot of different tools, and many people ask then, what do we do with the tools? We often hear about many pilots that are taking place, and many people wonder, where do the pilots actually bring us? I often say the airline pilots usually bring us to a clear destination, but a lot of trials and experimentations, we're actually not very sure where are they landing, or are they even going anywhere. But I don't think there is a tension or a contradiction between a scientific approach. By being clearer, what are the hypotheses we want to test, what are the things we want to verify, and using that to actually scope the trials and pilots that we do. So I think what I will share next is a perspective on Singapore's experience over the last decade to drive digitalization in the way we do urban planning, urban development, and how, as I extend from the planning and policy to the operational space, what are some of the possible perspectives from things that are a bit more certain to things that are perhaps, I think, less certain to me at this point. I've been working on digital transformation for planning and a design process for quite a number of years, working on how we drive research in urban analytics and urban complexity. So it will come a bit of a combination of the what and the how, which I think is a nice transition. So I think what is less clear, what is clearer and what is less clear. I think the idea of being able to use data to use digital twins, where they represent some form of the physical world to allow us to make better decisions. That is very clear, right? I mean, whether it's in terms of using it in urban planning and policy decisions, it's in terms of running daily urban operations. And these are important because they allow us to create better living environments for our citizens. It allows us to make sure that the city runs efficiently, runs well. People feel that they can trust what they can expect every day to get to their daily work, send their kids to school. And it also allows us to improve the services that we provide to meet the needs of the community. What are some areas, for example? I mean, Singapore, like many cities around the world, we have a lot of urban challenges. Aging population is one of those challenges that we face. And through the use of the insights, we are now much better able to be quite targeted in knowing which neighborhoods, which communities require more of what type of services, especially services that are quite niche in the community segments. For example, healthcare and elder care services, which as a nation that is aging rapidly, much less need of this in the earlier years, much more pressing needs today. But these are needs that are not spatially even. Certain neighborhoods need it more than others. Certain neighborhoods need it sooner than others. So how do we be more targeted spatially and temporally so that we make the right investments in the right location to create the greater impact? Another challenge I think many cities face is about mobility, right? So how, as a city, do we drive more active mobility? We want our citizens to use public transport, and this requires us to make the public transport service more reliable, where information is more readily available. You can easily know how many minutes the bus or the train is going to come when you're at the stop. It will turn up to bring you to the destination that you want to go. We also actively look at how we have better understanding on our pedestrian walkways so that we can know where to improve them, how to provide information to citizens, and more importantly, how we think about barrier-free access so that everyone is able to confidently get from where they want to go to where they want to get to. At the same time, as a city that has transited from what many know as a garden city to what we now call city in nature, our green infrastructure is something that we place a lot of emphasis on. Maintaining a city with more than 5 million trees is no mean feat, and the data today allows us to better monitor the health of the entire set of trees in Singapore. We are much better in knowing where we need to pay attention to send our tree doctors. We are able to look at the pruning work that we need to do so that our buses and our road doesn't get congested when trees fall. And we are also better able to understand our biodiversity, whether it's in terrestrial or marine, so that when works are going on, we have a better understanding of the impact. We have a better understanding of what are the ecological connections that they have. And these capabilities over the years came in very handy for COVID as well. During COVID times, we had much better information that could be provided to the public about which are the parks, which are the retail malls, which are the shopping centers, which are more crowded, so that people can make better informed decisions. The decision still lies in the individuals, but at least you have some idea of which time of the day and is it crowded now, that I can then decide, do I want to go to this place or another place? And it also allows us, because of the understanding of our communities, how do we support vulnerable households, such as our vulnerable seniors who are unable to leave homes, to make sure that there is enough food, there's enough social support that can be rendered in a very targeted way. These are not things that can be done if we do it as a blanket. As a city, we will not have enough resources to do so. But if I want to dive into the nuts and bolts of how we do it, I think I would sort of touch on 3 lenses and 3 sets of consideration. First is the lens of seeing data as an ingredient. And I would think that, we often talk about how we can use the data, but there are certain realities we will have to tackle. People often talk about data as an asset, as an air, as an oil. What I think is very clear is data is not cost-free. It is not cost-free in how it's collected. It is clean, it is managed, it is stored, it is protected. And more often than not, data are more naturally collected through operational process, through regulatory and transactional processes. But they are also needed for policy and planning purposes. And therefore, as we think about how do we make use of this data, it's something we need to be quite careful with. And last but not least, I think what many in the room would agree, right, is the notion that all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. Right? And how we then think about the use of these data and these models become very important, especially when many of the planning and policy processes are not by nature heavy in generating data, and it can be very costly if we were to have to generate data or collect data, and therefore the use of proxy data become more common. So that brings me to my second lens of translating data into actionable insights. Many of the data we use were fit for purpose for the kind of work that they were collected for. But as we start to use them for other purposes, which is where a lot of the returns are yielded, we then need to be quite careful with whether there are certain limitations that we see in the use of such data and models. Whether are they telling us the right thing that they tell us? For example, whether it's in the use of transaction data on public transport, or it's about using information about demographic patterns. Do they tell us enough and accurately in a timely manner? Are there certain biases that arise because of the nature of the data, because of how it is collected, because of who collects them? And thirdly, I think it's very important for us to ask ourselves, is it ethical to be using the data of such nature for such purposes? And these 3 considerations are important because I think it aligns well to how then do we think about this question of trust and responsibility, where many stakeholders face the challenge of aligning the interests of those who have the data and those who need the actionable insights. And what are some of the realities we often face? Well, naturally, people are concerned about cost, as I mentioned earlier. Who bears the cost? What is the expectation? What are the liabilities? How do we build trust between the partnerships between the owners and the users? And last but not least, how do we then work towards more win-win outcomes? So I feel these are things that I feel are more certain. Maybe if I have just 1 more minute.
We're very tight, so do it very quickly.
I think where there are emerging areas where it is maturing is really how cities use data to create more delightful experiences for our citizens. How do we reduce our carbon footprint, which decarbonization is high on everyone's mind? How do we strengthen the resilience? But I think in the horizon, as we build more models, and whether it's socioeconomic in nature, the questions that are a bit harder is, for example, how do we account for shifts in the behaviors and the choices that different individuals may make? Second, how do we account for the way the choices are made? Is it a choice of an individual, or is it a choice that is co-joined, where multiple individuals shape the choices together? And last but not least, I think transiting out of COVID to some extent, how do we account for phase shifts, where the nature of how certain things were like prior to a certain stage changes drastically after a certain phase? How do we take into account that? I think these are probably some of the more anticipatory areas we need to consider. Thanks.
Thank you, Zhongwen. Soledad, I should imagine every single one of those questions resonates with you, but you have to apply them in a different context with different resources.
Exactly.
Over to you.
Thank you. So in my case, it wasn't about digitalization of the system, but to use digital resources and tools to look into integrated risk management in vulnerable neighborhoods of Latin American cities. So our work is based on action research. So I work in academia, and I lead an interdisciplinary team of researchers both in the UK and in Latin America. So we worked in Medellin, for example, in Colombia, where we looked into landslide risk, in Mexico City, looking at flooding risk, in Puebla, also in Mexico, exploring risks related with climate change, particularly associated to a kind of urban transformation at the large scale in San Andres Cholula municipality, which was aimed to completely change the land use from agriculture to a dense urban fabric. And also in the Galapagos Islands, where we explored integrated water, energy and food nexus with adaptive co-management to promote resilience. So what we know in all of these projects and strategies is that top-down solutions and decisions, including smart solutions to reduce climate change-related risks, have failed to produce tangible results, particularly in these vulnerable areas of the Global South. So what we are looking at is approaches that are based on the co-production of monitoring, mitigation, and adaptation solutions that result from agreement between diverse stakeholders, which are promising, at least are showing promising results. So what we do in our research to test this is how we can co-create knowledge first to understand risks at all these different scales and from the perspective of different diverse stakeholders. To understand knowledge, so to build this knowledge base and increase community agency and then contribute to redressing social and environmental injustices. So our aim is to develop solutions and strategies that can be implemented and scaled up, but they're also technically appropriate and culturally sustainable to reduce risks. So to explain this a little further, the issues that really impact the local capacity, and that's really important on the conversation before, we worked very much at the local neighborhood scale with all of these projects, but in collaboration with different levels of institutional arrangements. So we need to understand the differences in the perceptions of risks, particularly in relation to the potential solutions, including infrastructures, so from government to community. The considerations of diverse social, economic, and environmental issues, such as the different types of knowledge, and this is really important, formal and informal knowledge, technical and social knowledge, all of these are required to interact in defining solutions and policies. The differences in stakeholders' needs and also power balances. So if we are able to understand these factors, we would need knowledge identification, knowledge development, and a compromise, and this is also key for the implementation of these solutions, a compromise at a range of power levels and across different actors for the implementation of these strategies. So with co-production, we have explored ways in which we can implement a dialogue of knowledges initially between these diverse stakeholders within a specific territory. And this has been challenging as well, because our work in cities is within the institutional arrangements of cities, so within the boundaries, the institutional boundaries. We're now moving to working within environmental units, which present such as river catchment areas, which present a much more complex set of institutional arrangements. But with these approaches, we want to create a space for knowledge exchange and conflict resolution. Conflict is also really important. So we can negotiate agreements and reach interventions. But also, the idea of co-production constitutes a method of questioning urban production processes as they are presented now, particularly in the way that these processes are creating social injustice and inequality. So we want to move beyond, and this is key for the panel, beyond the participative design to think about directly engaging stakeholders on the principle of equal partnership, so we reach an agreement. And maybe co-production represents, at least for the development of solutions, represents a kind of a transformation in a social ecosystem by altering existing relationships between actors and modifying practices, empowering communities with the notion of urban citizenship and opening up opportunities for adapted transformations through negotiated, agreed action. So to address resilience in our case at the local level within this approach of co-production and from a perspective that understands the multi-dimensional scales of risks, we need to think about three elements. Scale, which was mentioned before, particularly at the community level. Think about local risk management, and as this is the best, often the only option to think about direct action. And particularly because it represents very specific conditions of vulnerability and capabilities as well at the community level to respond to these vulnerability. Knowledge, so we need to understand the different types, the integration, we need to understand and integrate the different types of multifaceted knowledge and build collaborative, this knowledge between different actors through this dialogue of knowledges. And power, so vulnerable groups must be empowered to influence decision-making at the local level, so not just participation, but power, using community knowledge to respond to risks and assuming an active and participatory role in risk assessment, mitigation planning, capacity building, and monitoring. So to conclude, we need to think about social relationships in any system intervention. So we need to think about the social, cultural context, and we need to understand, particularly for risk management, the social, cultural fabric of the community and the public goods that communities want to protect. We also need to think about how technology-based intervention can work across sectors, cross scales, cross institutions. We need to think about technological solutions as tools for social transformation, providing a sense of agency and empowerment to communities, tools that can change, that are flexible. We need to maintain ongoing dialogue and transparency, we know that. We need to think what technologies exist already within communities. Even WhatsApp and Facebook channels have been really useful for us. So maybe new solutions are not the most important. Continuity is key. Gendered roles at the community level are also essential. How does gender plays a role within community interventions? What impact they have on the implementation of solutions? We need to understand bottom-up and top-down risks. So today we see the greatest discrepancy in history between the technological possibility of a better society, a more just and solidary society, and the political impossibility of reaching these. So we must explore our challenges with a perspective that tackles these unequal socioeconomic systems and balance power with innovative forms of governance that allow inclusive decision-making at all geographical scales. Thank you.
Thank you, Soledad. I think you've set it up perfectly for what Dirk is now going to address in the context of political and social accountability. The learnings out of the first part of this experience is every context is different. What is appropriate technologically across different dimensions poses different challenges. But in the final analysis, if there is not trust, if there is not what you've described as co-development or co-participative development, if there is not an ability of citizens to feel that they own and benefit from what we are incorporating technologically, then by definition we won't succeed. Dirk, over to you.
So you've heard about the great opportunities that modeling complex systems in a data-based way can actually provide for governance today and in the future. And one of the areas which has become really a big business model, and there are great hopes for it, is digital twin. So basically, as close as possible digital copy of reality. And the idea is appealing. So if we had a digital twin of a system of interest, we might be able to know what happens before it happens. We could better understand the system. We could try out different measures before and see what would be the implications, and then apply the best solution? The question is, the best for whom? So here is certainly a question that needs to be addressed. Now, how does that work? There are new technologies such as the Internet of Things, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. And you would be amazed with what would be possible in the future with convergent technologies and nanotechnology, biotechnology coupled with digital technology and all this. So digital twins will be a big business, and it's already there. The question is really, what would be the social and societal implications? The approach works very well for infrastructures, for production plants, reasonably well for logistics, but less well for complex dynamical systems. This includes weather, people, and society, that's us, and our body and health. So some of the questions that we need to be concerned about is about privacy and self-determination. We're talking about potentially quite intimate data. So we've heard about digital twins for cities, ecosystems, and for the planet and its climate. But also, on the other hand, there will be digital twins of our body, mind, and health. At least this is what people are working on. There are great hopes for that. But whom would you give such intimate personal data? Should the military govern it? Should the government govern it? Should it be a big IT company? Should it be the Secret Service, your health insurance? And here you see basically we're somehow in trouble. We are now living in social technical systems because we use those tools to change our society. We have made great progress in terms of technological innovation, but social innovation basically has not kept up with that quick change. And I think we need new social innovation and frameworks in order to be able to govern those technologies well and make sure that they will be at our service, that will have the opportunities used and risks minimized. This concerns ownership and control of data. I think the problem is unsolved. There are ethical issues, all sorts of them, a lot of them. And we also don't know the systemic effects of the interventions that would be made. Given that those interventions may be on a global scale, if something goes wrong, the accident could be big. The damage could be big. There could be even cascading effects in all of this. So we need to be careful. There are also issues with big data and machine learning approaches. They're powerful, but they have limitations. And so we need to worry about inaccuracy, errors, and uncertainties. And in order to really make the best out of this technology, we need a lot more transparency than today. I think there is a huge lack of transparency. It's the precondition really for accountability, which is important for trust and for public support. If we don't have those mechanisms in place, and currently I think there's really a lack of putting those mechanisms in place, then there is a risk that we would also see bad applications, immature applications. We've been talking about conflict and war also within the other sessions. All of that could be potential issues, really. And so we need to find a new governance framework, which would be a lot more participatory. Co-creation would be enabled, and it would be our system. So we would have to be able really to have an impact on that system and how it works, so it works for us. This is certainly something that GESDA needs to work towards. The United Nations and many other institutions. I think it's a great challenge for politics and diplomacy, because we are far from having that framework ready while technology is already here. So the question that we need to address is how to empower citizens and stakeholders, how to promote coordination, cooperation, collective intelligence, and public benefits. So participatory mechanisms are really at need. There's a new revived discussion about democracy, how we can digitally upgrade it in order really to have an inclusive approach that would allow us to address the challenges ahead of us more effectively, which include also environmental challenges and many other social and economic challenges. I don't need to repeat it. I mean, you open the newspaper and you know that the world is in trouble and we need to have new solutions and a new socio-economic, technological framework for the world of the future.
Thank you, Dirk. Right. We now have a guest online. And as that guest, Sami Kanan, represents the city of Geneva, I think we're all waiting with bated breath, Sami, to hear what your conclusions are, both in respect of current applications in Geneva and if anything that you've heard in the course of the discussion thus far gives you new ideas in terms of how this might be pushed forward. Sami.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you hear me well since I'm very far away. I'm in South Korea. Actually, the Congress of the United Cities and Local Governments, it's a major network of cities and local governments across the world. And it's interesting because we have also the digital discussion here, and especially the role of local governments. So I heard with interest Singapore, which is both a state and a local government in a way. And also with much interest, the other contributions. Since the last one, just before me, the previous one was Professor Helbling, I fully agree with all what he said and what the other contributors said. There is a lack of trust and framework for advancing the digitalization in acceptable framework and inclusive framework for everybody. I mean, the technical evolution is extremely quick, becomes quicker and quicker. The commercial one goes mostly with the technical one, and it's obviously attractive for, citizens, consumers to test new options. Now we are talking about metaverse and all these quite, fascinating, funny things. But the risk is obviously that we forget the crucial issues that we all have to tackle with. The classical issues, migration, climate change, social inequalities, urban planning, urban management. And the digitalization should be used as an opportunity, but not have the risks of it and the bad sides of it. So as a local government, Geneva has tried. We are not pretending to be much better than others. Many cities are working on a digital policy. And the first step of that was to convince actually members of the local parliament, for example, or even the administration, that there should be a digital policy. There is still the impression that digitalization is a tool. You just call the IT people and they make solutions. And when it doesn't work, they fix it. And whatever happens bad, it's their fault. If the new software doesn't match with the needs, it's because the IT people didn't really understand the needs. So now, even in our administration, you had this phenomenon. So now it's changing, and we really established or formalized digital policy for the city. First step, obviously, and we were late, to be honest with that, is to make the evolution of the administration itself towards the citizens, to make more digital, accessible for all the usual business you have to do with administration, being compulsory issues or free issues like culture and sports, but also to organize our own administration in a different way, and giving through the message that digitalization is mainly a human question and not a technical question. It's a management issue. So everybody has to feel concerned and to be totally involved in designing the changes and implementing them. And even in the administration, we have a kind of digital divide, because some of our staff is doing manual jobs on the streets and so on, and they admit it. Actually, they feel sometimes lost when suddenly new procedures imply some kind of digital dimension. They don't see the advantage, they see actually the obstacle to it. The second big issue is obviously the ethical one in the widest sense, that how do we behave as a city in an ethical and in an exemplary way with our data policy, with also the energy consumption, I mean, the whole environmental issue around digitalization. We know that the carbon footprint of the digital world is increasing very fast. It's going beyond the civil aviation, meanwhile, so it's to be taken seriously. And the third one is to break the digital divide also widely, not only the administration, but to contribute at least that within the population, we can go beyond the digital divide. It's a very perverse divide because most people who feel uncomfortable with digital procedures or processes or tools, they don't dare to admit it because they feel like ashamed somehow. I mean, we are all supposed to be professionals and use and very experts. We saw with the pandemic, it was both an opportunity because everybody had to somehow get acquainted with video conferencing, with school at home and so on. But for many families in Geneva, it was a trap because they didn't even have a computer at home. And parents or even kids were lost how. No, using a smartphone is one thing, but how to connect, how to have some kind of continuous implication in the school system. Even teachers, to some extent, were lost, to say. So digital divide is a serious issue if you want that people feel a trust. The word trust came very often in the previous contributions, and that we somehow don't lose somebody behind us. And the fourth one, which is very important, is obviously to foster innovation and creativity. I'm also in charge in culture in the city of Geneva. So artists and cultural entities are very creative in general. So, but not only them, also local companies, academics. And we have in Geneva a fantastic ecosystem of very creative people, but it's not yet correctly connected between the various type of actors to be sure that this creativity can go beyond like small groups and be of benefits for everybody. And we try to improve our data management. I was listening with interest to our colleague of Singapore as a business tool for the city. But again, we have to be very transparent how to use it, for what purpose, which will type of control mechanism. For example, video surveillance of public space, CCTV. It's a usual tool, but who are defining the rules with what, how to be careful about bias and so on. So to end, since we're in Geneva at the GESDA summit, it's an issue which is being discussed here in South Korea at this Congress of Local Governments. We definitely lack a collective framework, a regulatory framework for digital issues. I know there have been attempts. We have the ITU, we have the Geneva Internet Platform, we have many bodies, but we really need a discussion about effective framework rules, like we had, it was mentioned in the past, the 18th century, the Convention of Geneva for humanitarian issues. They're not always respected, unfortunately, but still they exist. Human Rights Declaration and so on. And Geneva is specialized in establishing commonly accepted, discussed, negotiated, and accepted rules. And we really have to tackle this issue in the international organizations and around it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sami. I think what's splendid about that contribution is it recognizes that even in a location like Geneva, which by definition in terms of advancement, technological capability, creativity, and representativity in terms of the global ecosystem, you've identified very clearly what the challenges are. And I think if there's a single theme that's come across all of the presentations in the course of today, it is the fact that the technology is way ahead of the social context, way ahead of the normative frameworks, way ahead of the regulatory and legal context that society needs in order to ensure that the technology is used for purposes with which society will feel comfortable. That's the challenge. Now, we treated this particular session in a very special way. It's quite different to quite a number of other sessions. It's precisely because of this wide divide between what is possible technologically and where we are in terms of our understanding of how best we ought to regulate it. Dirk has touched on a most important point in respect of that latter. Ironically, it may be, this is just a provocative remark, don't take it too seriously, but it may be that we are reaching the end of the apogee of representative democracy. It may be that digital instruments give us the ability to allow for far more participatory engagement in democratic decision-making. It may be that the co-creation that Soledad was talking about in local communities is viable not only in terms of personal exchange, but also in digital spaces, increasingly. We're not there yet. That technology is not yet mature, and the level of trust, acceptance, and agreement among society is not there yet. But it's an interesting possibility as we come to grapple with the challenges that the panel has laid out for you, I think, so well this afternoon. So I'm going to close. I'm sorry I'm not going to the floor, but you know what's going to happen if I do that. We'll be here for another hour. If you'd like to be, I'm very happy to do it, but I suspect some of you may want to eat. So let me close with a proposition in terms of what GESDA is going to focus on in the course of the next year. It's going to take the lessons out of what is being done in the most advanced technological spaces, bringing together, as the IDEA Consortium, if I may quote you, Neil, in respect of this from an earlier presentation, the IDEA Consortium seeks to observe and analyze the relationship between large-scale change and local impact. How? By, as Neil said, building model ecosystems, applying long-term observation, experiments, and modeling to understand how those ecosystems are likely to function over decades, to build collective intelligence strengthened by socio-ecological simulation, so that we can, in fact, develop real socio-ecological foresight. Because we can't use these models unless we have real socio-ecological foresight. So that's the first thing. GESDA will try to encourage the interface between different efforts in these spaces in order to advance that progression. But secondly, as Soledad's presentation set out so clearly, and even Sami's in respect of the digital divide and the vulnerable within Geneva, there's a huge divide. So unless we can make this technological capability more widely available into Latin American environments, African environments, South Asian environments, Central Asian environments, and more extensively around the world, then we can't really think about being able to deploy the potential of this technology for the purposes that we're describing. And then finally, to Dirk's point, unless we are able to embed control, ownership, management, governance, normative direction in citizens, in the societies and communities in which they're located, then the technology won't serve any purpose. GESDA has those three objectives: to understand who we are as humans, to understand how to live together peacefully and thrive, and to understand how we can do that within the limitations of the Earth system, maximizing it for greatest advantage. So that's what we're going to try and do over the course of the year ahead. I would seriously invite you, please, we will make sure that a link is available for that purpose. Any of your suggestions, proposals, comments, criticisms, as a result of what you've heard today, please let us have them. Collective intelligence means exactly what it says. The idea is to learn from everyone and draw it together in useful ways. I can see that Singapore hasn't lost its whole of society approach in respect of this. So what we need to do is to be able to understand how to unlock the potential that is present in these technologies and to ensure simultaneously that they actually work for the benefit of society because society actually controls them. Thank you very much. If you would give the panel a round of applause, I'd appreciate it.